morning. I'm Mayor Tommy Roberts. Welcome back to the Mayor's Table. And my guest this morning, once again, is City Manager Rob Mays. And Rob, it's good to have you back.
Good to be here.
Rob, this morning I want to revisit our 2017 fiscal year budget and kind of update our viewers on what's trending in the first 4 months of fiscal year 2017. We had dedicated a segment of the Mayor's Table to the development of the 2017 budget. And so we were obviously working on some assumptions, and now we have 4 months of history. And although we will continue to work on some assumptions going forward, we do have that 4-month history that provides us some ability for more solid analysis of what to expect for the remainder of the year. So I just want to open it up to you in a very general sense and let you talk about this 4 months of history.
Yeah, so as you said, we're about a third through the year, and towards the beginning of the year, we did do a Mayor's Table episode on kind of what we thought was coming and how we would potentially manage it, and we talked specifically about how we laid out some early intervention contingency plans because we closed the end of fiscal year 16 really very poorly. I mean, as it turned out, to balance the budget in the previous calendar year, we spent over $3 million of cash reserves, so previously booked revenue, to balance and pay for services last year. We started into this year with a balanced budget, but very quickly the GRT trend turned very negative, and quickly we began to have projected deficits. So we laid out a 4-level plan. As you recall, the first 2 levels we actually implemented the very first month of the fiscal year. Mm-hmm. So it was very dynamic, changing dynamics even as we were adopting that final budget. That first levels 1 and 2 included 5% reductions in our expenditure budget. We went through every department and cut things down. We tried to find areas that we could cut that would have minimal immediate impact on our citizens and the services. So things that would be, we kind of a delay and deferment strategy. We've been delaying hiring in many cases, with exception primarily of public safety positions. We're holding a lot of positions, deferring capital expenditures. We're not buying any fleet vehicles this year. We reduced a number of training and opportunities, and that again cut about $3 million from a budget, or 5%. So we implemented level 1 and 2. Kind of probably the gist of the update today, 4 months into the year, of our revenue tracking and closing out the first quarter of our expenditure tracking. We really have moved into level 3 of that, as we would measure and identify our projected deficit, meaning projected expenses to projected revenue.
Well, we've budgeted about an average of $4.2 million in revenue from GRT for fiscal year 2017. And in our 4-month history, we're averaging about $4 million.
Right.
So if we extrapolate that kind of a deficit on the average out over a full 12 months, we have about a $2.4 million deficit based on projections.
That's right.
And does that get us into that phase 3 and phase 4 consideration?
That would be what we would have identified as the phase 3. It doesn't get us into phase 4. So what it represents, it's a little higher than that. It's about $4.25 million a month. So it boils down to it's almost $3 million, an additional 5%. It's not quite that. So we kind of looked at it as the phase 3 was potentially another 5%. That was the phase that we identified. Now the actual deficit that we have is closer to that 2.4 million that you just mentioned. So if everything continues the way it is now, revenue stays exactly the way it is, has the last 4 months at that $4 million level, and the expense trends continue like they are with our reduced budget by 5%, we have a projected deficit at the end of the year of $2.4 million that we have to manage by really one of two ways, either to cut further into the expenditure budget or to deal with it from a revenue option, potentially dipping into cash reserves in a prudent manner, which to cut deeper into expenses now, I think we've all recognized the first two levels, we were primarily able to do it things that would have minor to no immediate impact. They're not sustainable. We can't go forever without buying police cars. But the kinds of impacts that you'll see now are we've had reduced hours at some of our facilities. Some of our offices are closed at noon when they had been previously open during the lunch hour because we have positions that we've not filled, so we can't staff things the same. Moving into level 3, if we do it through expenditure cuts, it gets much more impacting. We are talking about not filling potentially public safety positions or potentially cutting back on, we have one strategy in mind where we would take a ladder truck off the street and 5 or 6 firefighters with it. Across the board, all of our facilities, we've identified what those cuts would be. In some cases, it would mean closing facilities, significant reduced hours. We're just kind of down to that point where we're really at that point where we have to ask if we have any other option available to us than cutting those services. I think that's what the public would want us to look at.
And I've stated on a number of occasions where I've had a chance to talk about the budget circumstances that we're dealing with that I'm in favor of tapping in to our cash reserves. Obviously, that's not sustainable, but I believe we have another 4% tolerance in our cash reserve, 4% as it relates to our projected expenditure budget for 2017. So that's about another $2.4 million, and but we can't take it down much lower than where it would be if we do take that additional $2.4 million. We would still be well above minimum state requirements at that level. But again, there's a level of prudence that we have to utilize in the exercise of our judgment, and I would be uncomfortable taking it down any farther than that. So if that's the direction the council would go, in other words, to use cash reserve to deal with these so-called phase 3 deficits, then we would want to have some level of assurance that that the threats to our tax base are not growing. And that's part of the problem in projecting budgets, right. Projecting revenues particularly. Do you see anything on the horizon that presents a threat to our tax base?
Yeah, well, absolutely. We've talked about this many times. Our state legislature has been conducting a policy of, instead of dealing with the core issues of the tax base problem that the state has from removing so many things from the tax base, putting pressure on everything else, they've determined that the strategy is to take it from the city. So we've already gone through that. We're going to lose about 11% of our revenue over a 15-year phase out. The last 2 legislative sessions, the regular a year ago and the special, they came back after us for more. So we're bracing for January there to be a strategy of kind of a game-changing strategy of things as radical as completely reneging on the hold harmless 15-year phase out. That would immediately take another $5 million from us. So, we're talking about a complete game changer of the city of Farmington as we know it. That's out there in January. I'm confident that we'll continue to fight that good fight and hope that at least the majority of our local legislative group will stand with us in opposition to that. So barring that game changer that's outside of our control, I think it's reasonable to conclude that we've got a 4-month pattern now. Possibly we have found that relative bottom. If we have, the plan we have in place related to using a prudent level of additional cash in combination with the cuts we've made, we have a plan in place that ought to take us through fiscal year 2016. So if the plan we're on now is one that bridges us to that point, and if we start to see some relative recovery and positive trends, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think at this point we need to mention that the state legislature met in special session recently, concluded that session, but during that session there was a proposal in the Senate to hasten the phase-out period by the equivalent of about a year and a half. It would have meant about a $350,000 or $360,000 immediate hit to the city of Farmington. We were fortunate to avoid that consequence. We had great support from our legislators in the House, who two of whom serve on the House Ways and Means Committee, where the Senate bill first went for hearing in the House process, and it died in the House Ways and Means Committee. So we want to thank our legislative delegation for their support on this issue. But as you mentioned, we're gearing up for a bigger fight in the 2017 legislative session that will begin in January. It's a 60-day session, and so a lot can happen during that session. So we'll be doing our homework and doing our advocacy work to try to keep our legislative delegation on board with us on that issue. I think the other component of the level of threats that we deal with have to do with commodity pricing, natural gas and crude oil pricing. What we have seen here recently is strengthening of those commodity prices, and I think that bodes well for us as a city that relies fairly heavily on a strong oil and gas and extractive industry sector in our local economy. Rob, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close this segment?
Just to kind of give that perspective on cash, if you go back to prior 2009 to the recession, the city used to maintain about 8 to 10% cash reserves. Even during the recession, we made a high priority of building our cash reserves. We built them up to 18 to 20%. And the fact is, we have indeed relied upon that cash over the last several years, and that cash now is moving back down to where if we do dip into this at the prudent level that we're talking about, it gets us down there in that 10 to 12% range. It's still, barely, that would exceed the state minimum, but I think people need to understand, both our citizens as well as our legislature and state, that really kind of becomes the end of the cash option. So if our legislature would take something like the $5 million from us, or any amount really, it really leaves us the option of having to cut services or continue to look at the tax increases that the state has pushed off on us. So we wouldn't want anybody to think that this cash is a recurring option. It's been a strategic option, but we're kind of at the end of that strategy.
Well, we'll continue to monitor this program aggressively and to advocate aggressively for the benefit of our citizens. And this is not the end of our discussion about the 2017 fiscal year. There's still more to come on that, and we'll try to keep our viewers posted through another segment of the Mayor's Table at an appropriate time. We want to thank you for joining us today on the Mayor's Table, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next Monday.